What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we are taking a look at Numeron's deck got new support in Maximum Gold, and after such a long time we can finally accurately play the strategy that we all saw in Zexal as kids. We saw Don 1000 using it and we thought it was absolutely ridiculous and broken, but in the TCG it is not as good as we expected. So yeah, do not think that this is a competitive Numeron build, this is more of a casual build that summons Numeronius and Numeronius Numeronia as consistently as possible. You can win games even without them by just using the actual strategy, but if you want an actual competitive Numeron build, then this video is not for you. We have other profiles for competitive Numerons if you want to check them out. So this is a more casual build, so before we begin with the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off with the monsters, we have 3 copies of Numeron Wall, pretty standard. In any Numeron deck you have to play it, it gets you access to your Numeron network, and it has a hand trap effect that in this particular build it comes up a lot. So when you take damage, you special summon this card from your hand and you end the battle phase. And this is important because if you're trying to summon Numeronius, you have to summon Sonya first, and when you summon that monster, you leave yourself wide open so your opponent can pretty much OTK you. So having this card in your hand can actually save you some games, so you can come back and summon the monster you want during the next turn. Now, in order to summon Numeronius, you have to pop one of your own monsters with a monster effect, so you need to play a couple of cards in order to be able to do that. Now, I've seen some builds playing the Unchained package, but I think if you're trying to complement a Numeron strategy with other cards, you have to play cards that actually help you going second as well, so you can OTK with the Numerons if you don't really need to go for the imaginary chaos numbers and the Sith 1000. So the first card we have is 3 copies of Exiled Force. Now this is a really old card, so for any of you who don't know what it does, I'll explain it. Basically, it's a monster that you can tribute to target a monster on the field and destroy it. So it's a cost to tribute, so even if your opponent negates this, you can still tribute this card and get it off the field, so you can actually activate your Numeron network and Numeron calling, so you don't have to rely on something else in order to get rid of this card. This is why the Unchained package is a little bit iffy, because these cards don't do anything on their own unless you already have the monster you want to pop on the field. These cards can pop your monster and can pop your opponent's monsters, or at least attempt to do so to bait negates going second, so you can actually go for the OTK. And also with the same logic, we play 3 copies of Archfin Eccentric. This card basically does the same thing as Exiled Force but more, because on top of having the exact same monster effect, you can also put this card in the scale because it's a pendulum monster, so you can pop a backer as well. So these cards help you clear the board or bait your opponent's interruptions before you go for your Numeron network, and then you can OTK with the gates like a normal Numeron deck. And the last monster we play is 3 copies of Gameciel, because you need to play something like a Kaiju. Normally I would play Lava Golem, but because I do play a lot of normal summons in this particular build because of Exiled Force and Eccentric, I decided to play a Kaiju instead of Lava Golem just to be able to have more freedom in what I do. So you can play Lava Golem if you want, but I think you're going to contradict yourself sometimes because you do play other monsters as well. For the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Numeron Network, pretty standard, you have to max it out. And now it has a lot of copies to target, because before you were only copying one of those 2 copies of your Numeron calling to get your gates on the field, but now on top of having that access, you also have 2 more cards. So the first one is Numeron Chaos Ritual. This card gives you access to Numeronius, so if your Sonya is destroyed by a monster effect and you have a Numeron network in your graveyard or in your banish zone, put 5 of those numbers and your Numeron network under your Numeronius and you summon it with 10,000 attack points. So the concept that having a monster with such high attack value is very awesome, and this is why a lot of people are attempting to build this deck, even though it's completely unoptimal, but still it's such a nostalgic deck for Zexal, and the fact that you have such a strong monster makes it even better. So this is why people are trying to make this work, and this is why this profile is for you, because I know that it's very frustrating to try to make a strategy like that work. So I think if you're trying to make an unorthodox strategy work, you have to be able to win games even without it. So this is why I decided to make the deck like this. We also have 1 copy of Numeron Storm. If you control Numeronius monster, you destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls, and you do inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent. This is another card you can copy with your Numeron network because it's a Numeron spell card. Now, the only thing we're missing in order to make this deck really accurate compared to how it was in the anime, we need the Numeron traps. If Konami ever prints these cards and can actually make Numeron network a kind of a disruption effect, then this would be really cool. So I'm just hoping that Konami sometime does that, but until then we have a lot of cards already to work. Next we have 3 copies of Memories of Hope. I think this is pretty standard in Numeron decks, especially now without Zexal, so you'll be able to draw more cards, and you have a lot of cards that you need to draw in order to be able to go for a game. And the thing is that if this card resolves, most of the time your opponent doesn't have anything in general, because if your Numeron network gets your gates on the field, then that means your opponent did not have something to interrupt the network, so this card is going to resolve most of the time unless your opponent has Ash Blossom, because Ash does not interact anything other in this deck. So this is why this card is really good, but also can sometimes be really bad at the same time. But unfortunately you have to max it out, because when it resolves, it's such a big reward. Some one-offs, we have 1 copy of Terraforming, of course, searching your network. 1 for 1, getting access to your wall, because wall can be used from the field as well if it's the only card on the field to get network on the field. 1 copy of Rhoda to search the Exiled Force Force to have more copies of cards that can destroy monsters, 1 copy of Feather Duster. Even with Numeron Storm, you need to play cards like this because, like I said, you need to be able to win with the Numeron engine itself without going into Numeronius, and Numeron Storm requires you to have a Numeronius monster on the field in order to destroy the back row, so this is why you need to play some back row removal of your own before you can actually do that. We play 3 full Burial Goods. This card is here because, if you were paying attention, Chaos Ritual has a really bad requirement. You need to have Numeron Network in the graveyard as well as destroying Sonya with the monster effect. So even if you can do the first, sometimes you cannot do the second and vice versa. So this is why this card is here, because if you have a Numeron Network on the field, the only way to activate another network and put in the graveyard is by hard activating one. You cannot activate Numeron Wall because you have to have no other cards on the field in order to be able to use that. So unless you activate a Numeron Wall turn 1 and then kept the network in your hand to activate on top of the other one during the second turn, then you don't have a way to activate Chaos Ritual. So this is why this card is here, to make the activation requirement a little bit easier. And we also play 1 copy of Metal Force Fusion in order to have something to draw if you brick. So this is why I don't like giving Metal Force Fusion the option of being just the 1 card. So when I'm playing it in any type of deck with Foolish Burial Goods, I try to give it multiple purposes, so you can have the draw card and also have another card that you want to send with Metal Fusion to the graveyard and with Foolish Burial. We also play 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. I think that this card gets the absolute most amount of value in this particular deck just because it cuts the the monster's attack in half. So you can actually go for game very easily, because if your opponent has a lot of monsters on the field with a lot of attack points, even if you get your gates to 8,000, sometimes you cannot outgate, but with droplets it's very easy to do so. And on top of that, it negates everything, and you don't really mind discarding your entire hand in this deck. As long as you have 1 Numeron Network, you can go for game. So you can basically discard 4 cards and negate pretty much everything, activate network, summon your gates, and attack for game. So this card, I think, it's the best possible scenario for this particular deck, just because it gives you so much value. And it's also another going first card that can actually work. You need to play going first cards in the main deck in a going second deck, because if your opponents get the idea of how the deck works, then you need to be able to not rely just on your side deck for going first, but you need to have some good cards that can be good going first and going second, and Droplet is one of those cards. 3 copies of Chalice. I do play this on top of Droplet just because you cannot play Dark Ruler no more in this particular deck, because you need to go for game. If negating your opponent's board and getting rid of it is okay, but if you don't go for game with this deck, then there's not much to do after you clear your opponent's board. So this is why I think this card is much better than Ruler. Same logic, you cannot play cards like Evenly Matched. You can play Lightning Storm if you want, but I feel like this card gives you a little bit better going first power, like I said, with Droplets, so I really like it. But of course, if you have access to Lightning Storm and you want to play it instead, then you can go ahead and do it. It's very good as well. The only hand trap I play is 3 copies of Impermanence. Just another card that I don't mind drawing as a 6th card, because if I was playing any other hand trap, it would have been really bad. For example, top decking an Ash Blossom, so this deck just needs all the type of effect negation it can get, so you can actually get rid of the monsters after you negate their effects. And Impermanence is also a really good card to draw multiple copies even after you activate Memories of Hope, because I've been testing the deck with other hand traps, and when I was drawing 4 cards, sometimes I was drawing multiple copies of Ash Blossoms, and this was the worst because I could not use them. So I decided to stick with only Impermanence in the deck. I think it's really good. And the last card in the main deck is 1 copy of Red Reboot, because it's another blowout card that you can use going second, just destroy your opponent with the gates, because you don't mind whatever they said, they're not going through the next turn anyway. For the extra deck, first of all, we play 2 copies of each of the gates. So we have 2 copies of number 1 Ekam, 2 copies of number 2 Ve, 2 copies of number 2, number 3 Trini, and 2 copies of number 4 Tzadvari. So these cards, I'm playing 2 calling, so you play 2 of each. If you want to play 3 of each, then you can actually play 3 calling. The problem is that if you play 3 of each of the gates, then you have to play 1 copy of each of the 3 monsters I'm going to show you next. Then that means you will not have any space for link monsters. It doesn't necessarily need link monsters to work, especially if you want to hard commit on Numeronius. But like I said, I'm not relying on only Numeronius, because that would give me basically a 5% win rate, so I didn't really want to do that with any type of deck. So this is why I'm making the deck work even without it. So this is why I'm playing 2 of each. It has been working perfectly fine. I've never found myself going for the 3rd one, because this is a deck that you just don't go into a grind game. It's basically impossible to grind. You either destroy your opponent very early or you lose right away. So this is how this deck works, so I don't think you will ever get to the point of activating a 3rd call. Next up, we have Chaos number 1 Sonya. This is the card that helps you get access to your Numeronius, because it has a requirement on the Chaos Ritual to destroy this card when you have your network in the graveyard with a monster effect. So what this does is that you summon it over the number 1, and then it banishes all monsters on the field, and then next turn it comes back and burns your opponent if you have the network on the field. So you do a lot of damage with this card. The problem is that if you summon this instead of an Appaloosa or a Scaldra to draw cards, you're leaving yourself wide open. This is why I mentioned the second effect of Numeron Wall comes up a lot more often in this particular build than in a standard Numeron build, because you do leave your field open if you want to go for Numeronius. So yeah, this card is a bit iffy. Most of the times, you're not going to summon this going first. You're going to summon this going second after either you failed to destroy your opponent's board, or your opponent's board was like too powerful with negates and stacked, so your monsters would not be able to power up because they were getting negated or something. So this card is here for those reasons and to activate Chaos Ritual. Now, Now, for the new monsters, first of all, we have number C1000 Numeronius. So these cards, for what they require to be summoned, I wish they did more, because they do have the anime effects, which back in the day seemed really broken, but nowadays not really. So it has a quick effect that you can detach a material to destroy another monster on the field. Decent effect, a Dryden for a monster, but with the activation requirement for this card, you would have to Raigeki the field in order to be worth. And at the end of the battle phase, you destroy as many other monsters on the field as possible, and then you can special summon one monster from your opponent's graveyard to your field in defense. So if this effect was part of the quick effect, it would have been really good, but at the end of the battle phase, come on. But still, a really cool monster to try to summon, so this is why this card is here, and you'd also steal one of your opponent's monsters. And of course, if this card is destroyed by a card effect, you can special summon Numeronius Numeronia from your extra deck, and you put this card under it as material. And speaking of which, we have one copy of number imaginary C1000 Numeronius Numeronia. If you summon this with Numeronius' effect, it gains 100,000 attack and defense, which is absolutely incredible for any type of monster, and it has two types of effects. First of all, monsters your opponent controls must attack a Fable, and at the end of your opponent's turn, if this card did not battle, you basically win a duel. It also has a weird effect that when your opponent's monster declares an attack, you can detach a material to basically draining shield the attack. You negate it, and you gain life points equal to its attack. Now, I know this made sense in the anime, because they found a way to overpower this, but how in hell are you going to overpower this card to run it over in this particular day and age? I mean, there's no way you have a monster with more than 100,000 attack, so this is proof that they basically copy-pasted the effects of the anime, which is kind of unfortunate. I wish they innovated a little bit more to give them a little bit more power and viability for the requirements you need to be able to summon these cards. But still, if you win this with this card, I think it's one of the most satisfying ways to win a duel. So yeah, this is one of the most cool monsters that I've ever seen in the game with such high value. Same goes for Numeronius. So yeah, this is why I decided to play this build and try to make them work as consistently as possible, even though I know that it is not as good as I wanted to. And for the Link monsters, first of all, we have one copy of Megaclubs. Megaclubs is here because against certain matchups, your opponent is going to try to find a way to not negate one of your gates, but get rid of them from the field. Maybe, for example, with Heavenly Spheres or bounce it with the Ancient Warrior Link. So when you're left with 3 gates, you cannot really do much, especially if they put back the number 1. So you need to have a monster in order to summon using only 3 of the gates, and this is why you have Megaclubs. You can also play Unicorn if you want, but I think this card just gives you a lot more value because some decks cannot deal with it. So yeah, this card is really good. For the Link Force, we have one copy of Appaloosa. When you're going first, I think this is what you're going to be summoning most of the time, but you can also summon the one copy of Scaldred if you want to dig for more cards. Usually this is the card I'm summoning if I don't have Memories of Hope, because if I have Memories of Hope, going for a draw 8 is kind of greedy. You just get to draw 4 and summon Appaloosa, have the negates, but if you don't draw anything with Memories of Hope because you don't have it, summoning Scaldred in order to try to dig for the cards you want might be better. And we also have one copy of Underworld Goddess of the Closed World. This card is here in case you cannot deal with certain monsters, because if you know you cannot get tax in with your gates, some monsters might be difficult to deal with, but you get the fact that you have 4 monsters on the field with 1 card effect. So you just use those 4 monsters with anything that's problematic on your opponent's board, and boom, you have her on the field. So it's very easy to summon her, and since the extra deck is not really tight if you're not playing 3 Numeron Calling, I couldn't really find anything that would fit better in the deck than this. You can play other stuff if you think that anything is more worth, but this card has been working fantastically for me in the deck. So yep, that's the deck, guys. I think Numeron, when played like this, I think it's one of the most fun decks you can experiment with, although the problem is that you're going to be very frustrated sometimes, especially if you're trying to play in a competitive environment, because it's going to be very difficult to summon those monsters. But if you're playing casually with your friends, I think you're going to have such a blast trying to play this deck, so I highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of Zexal. You're going to remember those old days of remembering a deck that you thought that it would never get played in the TCG just because you thought it was so broken in the anime, and this was the same with Time Lords pretty much, but yeah, now we have them and they're not as good as we thought. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. We'll see you next time.